Hello and welcome back to Sustainability Matters by the Gruyter Brill. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser. We continue focusing on sustainability in scholarly publishing, including the humanities and beyond. And today we examine research promotion and we ask, is it worth it? Citations are a central pillar of the academic landscape. Being cited more than one's peers doesn't just elevate one's profile in an abstract or intangible manner. It demonstrably leads to greater job market opportunities and more funding for one's projects. All of these variables can be measured and tracked. And yet, surprisingly, the relationships between these variables have not been. What exactly is the relationship between research communication and citations? Does social media buzz matter more or less than mentions in mainstream media news articles or appearing on television news? Do academic citations drive external media, or does external media drive citations? What are the best methods to increase one's non-academic mentions? And after all of this, what are the ethics of pursuing this line of thinking? If we each individually try to game the system, at what point do the current incentives yield perverse collective outcomes? To help us answer all of these questions and so much more, we are so excited to be joined today by Drs. Stefan Lemke and Isabella Peters. They are co-authors, along with Athanasios Mazarakis, of Path Model of the Interplay Between the Promotion and the Received Attention of Research Articles, which is a chapter in the book, The Science Media Interface on the Relation Between Internal and External Science Communication, published by de Gruyter Brill. Drs. Lemke and Peters, welcome to the program.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, hello.
Hello. So I was thinking we could follow the structure of your chapter, which more or less begins by having a look at your aims, methodology, and findings. And then as you do, have a bigger conversation about what your findings might mean. So reading your chapter, it seems that research on research promotion was, until your article, a little bit incomplete. What was your article seeking to do differently?
Yeah, so at the center of the project that was behind our article was this question whether external science promotion, so promotion of research that aims at audiences that are primarily non-academic, whether that affects somehow the inner academic impact of the same research. So for instance, if we have a research article that gets picked up by a lot of journalistic paper articles, is this then later related with higher citations within the academic sphere? And of course, there were many studies that somehow tackled these questions, but what we found is that they almost always focused on rather specific case studies, often only looking at a single journal at a time or a very small selection of journals, and also only considering a very small amount of variables at the same time. And now what we tried to add with our study is a more consolidating, more comprehensive perspective on this interplay between research articles promotion within different forms of external science communication and the later impact in various spheres as measured, for instance, by citations, but also as measured by mentions, for instance, on social media.
And maybe I can add that this use case is also interesting for us because this promotion or this research promotion is often very invisible to the authors of the research papers. So they do not really know whether something is happening. So if you talk to other authors of research papers, they do not always know that publishing houses put papers on embargo or that they do promotional material on those papers or whether they do podcasts. I mean, of course, then they know when they're invited, but all the things behind the scenes are very invisible to most of the authors and they don't know. And that is something which was also interesting to us to study, whether all those promotional practices really have an effect on the later citation counts.
The methodological approach that you chose was something called path analysis. I'm completely unfamiliar with it, apart from having read about it in your article. For the benefit of our audience, could you explain a little bit about what it is and how it differs from traditional statistical methods and why you chose it as the more suitable methodology for this study?
So path analysis can basically be understood as an extension of multiple regression that probably more listeners will be a bit familiar with. So it also follows this principle of having some variables of interest that we believe to be dependent variables of some kind, dependent from other variables, independent variables, and to model those dependent variables as some kind of combination of the independent variables. Now, what path analysis specifically allows us to do is to model multi-level interdependencies between variables within the same model. For instance, for us, it seems quite likely that if an article gets mentioned in press releases, then this will likely increase its likelihood of being mentioned within newspapers later. Those newspapers mentions, on the other hand, will most likely have some effect on the citations of that article later. And these kinds of multi-level interdependencies are something that path analysis is useful for.
Yeah, we use this method because, as Steffen already said, the world is not black or white, right? So communication goes via very many channels. It's not only one channel, but we have to look at all the different instances where a paper can be mentioned. And so it's very important to use methods that are capable of analyzing the complexity of today's information spaces and communication channels. And that is why we turned to the path analysis.
Got it. So you're counting for possible feedback loops. Wow, that's powerful. So your model tested 6 different variables. What are they? How did you choose them? Also, you mentioned earlier embargo emails. I have no idea what they are. Could you shed some light for me?
Sure. So to start with the variables you ask about, the first variables within our model are first the number of mentions a research article receives within mainstream news media as obtained from data provider altmetric.com, by the way. Maybe we will get back to that later. So that was the first variable. The second variable would be its data citations within other research articles based on Web of Science in this case. Then, as we mentioned earlier, we were also interested in social media attention as journalistic media and social media is so much intertwined these days, and also research communication takes place on social media to substantial degrees. And as the prototypical example for a social media platform that is quite broadly used within academic contexts, we looked at the number of mentions that research articles receive on Twitter, or now X. Then our fourth variable of interest would be the binary variable of whether an article had been featured in a publisher's embargo email. More on that maybe in a minute. Our fifth variable would be the binary variable on whether an article had been promoted in a press release. This time relying on data from eurekalert.org, which is the largest international database for science-related press releases. Last but not least, we also included a variable that should approximate the publishing journal's prestige, because it's just so well known that if an article gets published in a high prestige journal, then this will be extremely strongly connected to its expected later citations and also its expected later mentions within various forms of social media. So one just can't really leave that variable out. And you asked about embargo emails. Yeah, the embargo system is something that has been in place for many decades now in science journalism. So basically, it's an arrangement that means that scholarly publishers send advance information on the upcoming research releases to pre-registered journalists before those research papers get published, so that the pre-registered journalists have some chance to prepare their cover stories, their coverage of that research. And also the journalists get the additional benefit of having a certain amount of assurance that no other journalists will report on those research findings before them, as long as everyone respects the embargo, of course. And for the scholarly publishers, on the other hand, this embargo system comes with the advantage that the scholarly publishers get a certain amount of control over which papers are reported on, which topics are highlighted and particularly present within journalistic media, and also a bit of control over the timing of the coverage. And that's basically how embargo emails work.
That's good to know. I wasn't familiar with it. I read the term in the article and I was a bit befuddled. So that's really helpful. So you built with these variables, you built a really impressive data set. It has to be said. I mean, there are over 67,000 articles that you pulled together for this analysis. I have a background in economics, and at least in the economics field, it seems so often the case that publicly available data sets are just totally overanalyzed. There's so much published on the back of them that it seems that what sets top-tier researchers apart is their willingness or ability to undergo the painstaking task of assembling their own data set that no one else has. You can, with Thomas Piketty or Danny Roderick, in the field of economics, this is well understood. They've all developed their own data sets. Can you share with us a little bit about the story of your experience building this data set? I mean, was it easy? Was it difficult? How laborious was it? How much time did it take? Did you face any particular challenges? I want to know everything.
So maybe before Stefan goes into the details of collecting all the data, I can say that in bibliometrics, it is not very well, it's quite likely to work with large data sets. So we are not very proud of building those data sets, I have to say, because we just want to analyze big. Well, there's a famous book also, which is called Big Science, Small Science. So we want to analyze the big science approach. So we need a lot of data. We want to understand the scientific system. So we need this data, and we cannot work without bibliographic and bibliometric data to do our analysis. So yeah, we are a little bit proud maybe, but it's not that much of a reputation or we do not gain so much reputation for just building the data set. But what I have to say is that when it comes to bibliographic and bibliometric data, it is often more of a problem for us to get to this data because the data is proprietary. It is hidden in proprietary databases. So, for example, from the Web of Science, Clarivate or Scopus and Elsevier, or dimensions. So we have to pay for it to get that data and to do those important analysis on the scholarly communication system. And what we also face is the challenge that we cannot share the data afterwards, right? So because we have to pay for the data, we cannot share it afterwards. So that is more of a problem for us. And luckily, nowadays, we have some approaches which I want to mention here. For example, there's the Curtin Open Knowledge Initiative that tries to build infrastructures and data sets to do those bibliometric analyses. And there's also the OpenAlex dataset, which is also openly available for everybody to do those analyses. But as you said, of course, in bibliometrics, we also have certain approaches. We have traditional methods, and traditionally we always relied on the Web of Science or Scopus to analyze data, and that is why we also used a large chunk of data from those databases, and that is something Stefan can dive into.
Yeah, combining those data sets from those various quite heterogeneous sources, that is quite laborious, of course, and takes a lot of time. Use the aforementioned Web of Science that Isabella just mentioned. I also previously mentioned altmetric.com as a data provider for mentions of academic outputs in other domains than the academic domain itself. So, for instance, mentions of academic outputs on social media, but also within journalistic media. And what helped us a lot in this particular project was that we collaborated with the German Science Media Center. I think there are also science media centers in other countries in Germany as a connecting institute between research and science journalism. Yeah, they had us a lot because that facilitated for us access to this complete data on Eureka Alert press releases. We had a very large database of science-related press releases available to us. And also, the access to the aforementioned embargo emails is something that the Science Media Center allowed us to do. Because usually this embargo communication between scholarly publishers and journalists is invisible, as Isabella mentioned earlier today, and something that we can't really track from the outside. And it was a very rare opportunity for us to get this chance to track the likely effects of those embargo email communications on later impact due to the access that the Science Media Center provided us with. Yeah, just as a last point regarding the challenges regarding assembling a data set as this one, there are some very positive developments, I think. Isabella just mentioned OpenAlex as an open alternative to Web of Science if it comes to bibliographic data of any kind. That's an option now that hasn't really been around when this chapter, for instance, was planned. So hopefully in the future, many more researchers would be able to do a study like this even without access to Web of Science, because OpenAlex exists now. Also, the rising prevalence of article identifiers like DOIs, digital object identifiers. This is something that makes it much easier now to match data from different sources than it would have been 20 years ago or 10 years ago even. But not everything is perfect. Not all developments are great. For instance, if we look at social media data, as I mentioned, we here looked at mentions that research articles had received on Twitter, and that's something that, for instance, would nowadays be much more difficult now that Twitter turned to X and API access for researchers has been cut down, and overall, the access to Twitter-based data is much more restricted now, and so there are positive but also negative developments regarding the labor behind assembling data sets like this one in the future.
Fair enough. So shall we get into the findings? This is what we all want to know about. I suppose the first question is whether promoting research externally works. Does it yield mainstream media and social media attention?
So our very general answer to that would be yes, definitely seems so. So what we've seen is that both embargo emails and also press releases are highly significant predictors for the amount of mentions in journalistic and to a slightly lesser extent also on social media later. And that holds true also in comparison to the effect that, for instance, journal impact factors have on these mentions, and that journal impact factors are heavily related to higher expected mentions has been shown extensively by studies in the past. However, what makes interpreting these kinds of models generally so challenging is, of course, the abundance of potential confounders, for which we often have no real way to control for on a large scale. So, for instance, it would seem absolutely plausible that there are some article inherent properties, like its general newsworthiness or the newsworthiness of its subject matter, that would directly affect both its likelihood to be selected for a press release, but also its likelihood to be mentioned on certain social media platforms. And it's something that we can't really control for on a large scale. Perhaps large language models could be helpful for that in the future, but not when this article was written or the study was performed. In general, I think this will continue to be a challenge. Therefore, what future research in this domain should do more is to complement these quantitative perspectives that we took in this study with more qualitative investigations of the processes and selection criteria behind the incidents that we are measuring here. For instance, what are the criteria that press offices apply when selecting certain articles for coverage within press releases? And are those similar criteria or different criteria than what academic authors later apply when deciding what to cite? And where are the overlaps and where are the differences? So, that's something that I think future research should focus on more.
So with that in mind, looking at your research, can you tell us what the best ways are to promote? I mean, are there good ways, bad ways, medium ways to promote my research externally to get the most attention?
Yeah, well, that is a good question and probably the one which is burning the most. Well, what we can say, and that is something we could have shown, or we have shown actually in several studies, is that like every intervention into the scholarly communication system has an effect. So if something is mentioned on more than one channel, it will always increase the citation count. And also, what I have to say that in bibliometrics, we do not really account for bad promotion or good promotion. So every mention, even if somebody is saying, oh God, the work that Stefan and Isabella is doing is really bad, and please do not do that again, this will increase our citation counts. And that is a good thing, right? So there's no semantics in citations until now. So we do not analyze that. So everything, every promotion, every mention in every channel is always good. So, and it will always increase something. It will always increase the citation counts. That is really what we have shown. But what we have to keep in mind, and that is why we keep on doing this work and analyzing all those variables and all those factors, is that as long as citation counts are such an important factor for tenure, for research careers, for everything, for promotion in academic careers, we need to understand how those citation counts are built, right? So if it's not about the quality of the research paper, but if it's about the promotion that the publishing houses are doing, if it's about the social media mentioned, if it's only about, mentioning or getting mentioned in a newspaper or so, and it's not about the quality, then we have to understand how those interventions affect the citation counts, and then we have to account for it later on when we want to, promote somebody, or if we want to hire somebody, or if we want to give somebody the PhD title or something like that. So that is why we need to understand what's going on. We can see how all those interventions affect the citation count in the end, and there's always an effect.
I was trying to disaggregate a little bit that process. So first looking at the best ways to get media noise, and then the best way to convert that media noise into citations. But you avoided both of those questions and answered them both at the same time. So, yeah, I mean, and fair enough. That makes a lot of sense. I do want to explore that question of the value of what we're measuring when we use citations as a proxy for quality. But kind of walking us through these steps a little bit more in a disaggregated manner, you refer to something called the publicity hypothesis that suggests that media exposure increases citations. So you're saying that the publicity hypothesis is a theory. It's proven. It's correct. That's what happens.
Well, the publicity hypothesis, I think, is one of the two main ways to explain this correlation between research articles' press coverage and their increased citations later. So the publicity hypothesis basically states that it is the visibility that's generated by an article being present within journalistic media that, more or less regardless of that article's inherent qualities, leads to also more researchers noticing that article and therefore being more likely to cite it later. That would be one way to explain this correlation. The alternative would be the earmark hypothesis. That basically states that journalists that decide on which articles to report on within journalistic media, and researchers which decide on which articles to cite within their own research papers, just independently of each other apply very similar criteria and have very similar heuristics to determine what is worth to be cited and worth to be reported upon in newspapers. And therefore would mean that those two parties and even other parties, like for instance press offices which research to feature in press releases, that all of these parties independently of each other mostly come to very similar conclusions about which papers are of high quality in some way. While both of these hypotheses I think seem plausible, and we wouldn't really dismiss one completely. there are various pieces of empirical evidence that highlights particularly likelihood of the publicity hypothesis holding true. So articles receiving higher citations due to the press coverage regardless of their inherent qualities. And in this academic world that you just talked about, where in many evaluation exercises citations are so important, and where this assumption is present that citations are a good proxy for research quality, such a finding is problematic, of course. That it's more or less just visibility that triggers citations, and no inherent qualities that are associated both with more citations and with higher likelihood of getting picked up by journalists.
Okay. I'm just thinking a little bit about the setup for your model, where you were controlling among your different variables. The last variable was journal prestige. And it sounds like what we're saying is that there's no such thing as bad PR from an academic citations perspective. How does journal prestige play into this? Does external promotion, I mean, if I'm published in Nature, I feel like I see a news article every week about something that's been published in Nature. I don't think I know any other medical journals that, are named in media. I mean, I guess that's going to your earmark or publicity hypothesis selection. Does media attention produce citations regardless of the host journal's prestige? What did your data set show?
First of all, what you, I think, just hinted at is something that we also found, that not really surprisingly, articles from high-impact journals are much more likely to attract press coverage and to be selected for any forms of external promotion, like press releases or embargo emails or coverage within newspapers, for instance. Those high-impact journal articles are then later cited more than other articles from the same high-impact journals that have not been featured within external promotion. However, there is a quite interesting finding by colleagues from another research group around Estelle Dumas-Mallet. And what they found is that, relatively speaking, articles from lower impact journals benefit even stronger from external promotion compared to other articles from the same journals than articles from high impact journals. They do not benefit enough to get somehow close to the amount of expected citations that articles from high-impact journals that receive promotion will receive. But there seems to be some interesting dynamic, the prestige of the publishing journal and the effect that external promotion has on respective research articles. What we do not know, however, is whether articles from extremely obscure or maybe even predatory journals could be pushed to really high levels of impact just by featuring them in the news. That would be an interesting question, of course, but such articles wouldn't really be present in our data at all because we obtain bibliographic data from this curated database, Web of Science, and there such articles shouldn't really be present. And I would also assume that probably journalists would only very rarely select articles from extremely obscure, unreliable journals for their news coverage. But that's something where we only can speculate.
That makes sense. My partner is a medical researcher, and they normally begin by when they have an article or piece of research they're very proud of, which they know is innovative and they've done a fantastic job on it. They'll begin by sending it to the top-ranked journals, and it won't always get taken. And there'll be a huge disappointment, and then you start working down the list of impact factor. And then randomly, some of their students or some of the papers they're less proud of will get picked up by these top-ranked journals. And they had just begun that process of, aim for the stars, you might reach the moon. You start with the most prestigious journal, not expecting that this particular article will get taken, and it gets taken up. So you don't always know what idiosyncratic factors are in the publishing editor's mind, what priorities they have for the next edition, that they're exploring certain themes which are more resonant with what that journal is looking to publish at that time. So it sounds like what you're saying is that if I have a particular piece of work that I've done that I know is innovative and important and well done, and for whatever reason has not been accepted by the top tier journals. It sounds like you're saying that is the time to invest in social media and news media, embargo emails, publicity, because, correct me if I'm wrong, if I'm hearing you correctly, everyone benefits from social and news media attention. But if I'm published in a top-ranked journal, I'm going to get a lot of citations anyway because it's already drawing my peers to look at that journal. But if I'm published in a lower impact factor journal, my peers may not see my work to cite it in the first place. And by taking a circuitous route via news media and social media, I draw their attention there and thus increase the citations that I would have gotten, multiple times, factors more than I would have if I had invested in social and news media after being published in Nature. Have I understood that correctly?
I think that sounds like a very valid way to interpret this. I mean, for most of these forms of external promotion, I guess it's not really within your control as an author whether your new paper gets picked up, for instance, for press releases or within embargo emails by the publishers. I mean, you can, of course, do your own social media promotion, but I think the whole journalistic area of external promotion is something that seems a bit out of your hands. But still, I guess it's maybe an optimistic conclusion that one could draw from these findings, that the external promotion can help to highlight articles that deserve attention, even though they did not manage to get to the very high impact journals, but that even if they end up in a comparatively low impact journal, that they still have a chance of attracting a lot of attention later if they get picked up by external promotion.
I wanted to ask you to go back to your path model methodology. I think one of the benefits of it is that it really draws clarity to the question of directionality between the different results. How sure can we be of the directionality of these results? And were you able to tease out any nuance on the question of directionality in your study?
So I'd say that for most directionalities within our model, we find some fairly strong arguments to be confident in them in past literature, because there is quite a lot of existing research on typical temporal relationships between research articles publication and the citations they later get and the attention they receive, for instance, on social media and within journalistic media. So, for instance, for most research articles, the attention they receive on social media and journalistic media tends to happen very closely after their publication, almost immediately. And citations, on the other hand, take much longer to accumulate, and typically the lion's share of citations for an individual article only happens 2 to 7 years after its publication. So these kinds of findings make us fairly confident about, for instance, the directionality between news mentions and citations. It's much more likely that the news mentions come first and the citations come later. However, there could, of course, be rare cases where these typical temporal developments get reversed, where an article that has been out for a long time and has also been cited already by researchers a lot, for some reason later gets picked up also by the news, because some topic just later becomes newsworthy for the broader public. There is this term of sleeping beauties that has been coined to explain these kind of phenomena for academic citations. So research articles that lay around for many years without really getting cited at all might just 20 years later suddenly receive a boost in citations because for some reason now some topic became extremely relevant. I think artificial intelligence is also an example for that, where many foundations were already written in papers in the 80s and 90s, then for a long time didn't really interest so many people, and later then became highly relevant again. But overall, to answer your question on the directionality of the results, I'd say we have, I think, a quite solid foundation of arguments to assume that these directionalities are the way they are. maybe one exception that we found during the optimization of our model is that a model that assumes a bidirectional relation between attention that articles receive in the media and their later citations fit our data better than a model that assumes a purely unidirectional relationship from media attention to citations. So perhaps future studies should critically reflect on this relationship and not just assume that it's always a case of media attention coming first, as I guess most studies of the past have done.
So science journalists are like Prince Charming.
It's the researchers that are princes and Prince Charming that are awakening the Sleeping Beauty later on. And I don't think that the science journalism people, that they go back to papers that have been published, 20 years ago or something. This doesn't really match the newsworthiness criterion that science journalism often brings, I think. But Ramzi, you're invited to study that effect with us, I think. So I think this is a good question, a good research question for us.
I would be delighted to. I'm more of a humanities-oriented person myself. And as we have this conversation, I can't help but think of the greater emphasis that the humanities places on monographs compared to STEM fields, which are a lot more focused on publish or perish in a constant stream of journal articles. And social sciences, of course, like economics, they kind of fall somewhere in the middle, which is to say that different fields have different priorities in citations and different priorities in patterns of communication. How generalizable are your findings or these findings across different fields of research?
Yeah, that question does highlight a very important limitation of this study. We here only focused on journal articles, and that's also part of the reason why such a large part of our data set is made up out of biomedical subjects, because biomedical subjects are just so present within the total data set of journal articles within Web of Science. One perhaps should also note that journalism's coverage of research overall is heavily skewed towards certain disciplines, with biomedical topics in many regards being the most prominent subject area, followed by certain social sciences, perhaps also by certain aspects of engineering sciences, while most humanities probably have a much harder time to attract journalistic coverage. Our findings will naturally be much less generalizable for fields like many humanities, or also for other fields that don't really rely on journal articles, like, for instance, computer science, where conference presentations or conference papers are maybe the main currency of academic output. I would assume our findings to be informative for subject fields in which journal articles are the common form of science communication. And other fields like the mentioned humanities with the emphasis on monographs, or computer science with this emphasis on conference publications, those would deserve their own appropriately focused studies, I think.
And if I may add, for the humanities or social sciences, it would be interesting to look at how they are covered in media, because we know that, for example, if a philosopher or so writes a new book, then it may appear in the feuilleton or wherever in the newspaper. But of course, it's a totally different type of reporting than what you do when you have a biomedical paper also, or stating that, okay, somebody find a cure for cancer or something, or diabetes. And so this is a totally different level for once in the journalistic coverage and in the type of reporting, but also in the type of scientific output, right? Because a journal article is usually much shorter than a whole book, for example. So there you have these different levels. And what we also know is that, for example, in the social sciences, for example, for economics, it's much more important to be cited or quoted as an expert in an interview, or as an testimonial for something, right? So that is mentions that are also analyzed, for example, in a ranking of economists, where they count how often an economist is mentioned in the newspaper, but it's not about their published papers, but it's about the expertise, about how they quote and how they have, or what opinion they have about certain situations and topics of interest. So it's a little bit different, but we could do these kinds of analyses, and they are already done. So we can find those.
Have you updated or extended your model in any way? I mean, this chapter was published some time ago, and you obviously worked on it before it got published. So the work towards it, I don't know, is perhaps 2 years old or something like this. Have there been any noteworthy developments on this line of thinking since between speaking today and finishing this research?
So in between, we haven't directly extended the model that's discussed in this chapter, but we have continued this line of research, and particularly by trying to disentangle these aforementioned complexities between publicity hypothesis and earmark hypothesis. So we try to come up with better answers to this question on whether it's a mere visibility granted by press coverage that leads to increased citations, or whether there are certain inherent article qualities that lead to both higher citations and press coverage. Maybe to very briefly summarize what those continuations have brought up is, while our additional results do support the publicity hypothesis, they do not really support the earmark hypothesis. So visibility seems to be a decisive part of this explanation of the relationship between press coverage and increased citations. Yeah, I think I also already mentioned what I think what the next steps should be, or what future research should be, and those would be those aforementioned more qualitative complements to this quantitative research. Investigating directly what are press officers doing when they select which articles to feature, and what are science journalists doing when selecting research for their stories, and so on.
We also talked to journalists, by the way, and asked them about their work practices and how they reference scientific articles, and whether they could if they would be willing, or if it's possible to, for example, incorporate more DOIs in their articles. Because right now with digital publishing, you do not really have the space limitations and so on. But to be honest, we found that it's really a totally different sphere the science journalism is working in. So they have a different work ethos. It's not that they think about us as and our problems as researchers and how we get promoted or tenured. So it's not their job to make sure that we get citations, right? So it's an interesting relationship we have here. And those journalists we talked to, they couldn't really see the problem. So they just work as they did. I mean, they increasingly incorporate DOIs or put the URLs to the studies, because, journalism has also faced some pressure in terms of trust, and so that you can follow where they have their information from. So that is something they do, but progress is slowly. And we would need that information. We would need the link between the scientific article and the journalistic article to get the counts. So I think we have to either continuously talk to each other and make sure that we work together. But at the same time, as you said before, Ramzi, it's a problematic thing anyway to count on citations for all the academic career. And it's really an ethical discussion we have to have, because the researchers and the scientific community need to understand what's going on when scientific papers are covered on media, and what the effects are, and whether we really still want to rely on citation counts. And I don't think that it's really the task or the job of the journalists to make sure that we get the count. So, but some others may think differently about that. But anyway, I think it would be interesting and important that both partners in the relationship understand how they influence each other, how those both systems influence each other. And that is something which we also try to address with the whole book in which our chapter appeared. So the science-media interface, because they haven't been talking to each other really lately or in the past. But I hope that this will start soon and that we can learn from each other.
Yeah, I wanted to end on that question, which I just think is that ethical question, which is really, I think, the context for all of this. I mean, citations are just so entrenched as the benchmark metric. To what extent are we really creating perverse outcomes by over-incentivizing citations as a proxy for quality? And what gets measured gets managed. But if we can't measure it, how can we manage it? So if not citations, what else could possibly take its place or complement citations as our way to index and rank and sort for quality? Do you have any closing thoughts on this broader issue?
First of all, I think I can speak for both of us that we absolutely agree. It's there's this law called Goodhart's law. As soon as a measure becomes a goal, it ceases to be a good measure. And I guess citations are a prime example for that. There are many known and well-documented detriments of this existing fixation on citations in academic assessments. Things like salami publishing or the formation of citation cartels. Yeah, I guess there are many good reasons to argue against this obsession in academia with citation counts and many indicators based on citation counts. But also, luckily, this is something that is discussed, and there are several high-profile initiatives with the aim of establishing a more nuanced and more holistic approach of evaluating scientific achievements and careers.
Yeah, definitely. Because as bibliometricians, we have a long history of telling all the others to not use citation counts the way they are used so far. So that was always our job. We always did this. Even the creator of the journal Impact Factor, Eugene Garfield, argued against the use of the journal Impact Factor for, using it in evaluating people, individuals. So it was always good to have a higher aggregation level. That is good. It's a journal impact factor. It's something to evaluate a journal, but it's never good to evaluate a person. So that is, I don't know, if you read books from 50 years ago, they always state this, nothing have changed. As you said, counts, numbers are easy to measure. It's easy to put a line under a ranking or so. It's just too easy to use, so they are used. But it's not the fault of bibliometrics because they have come up with more complicated, with more nuance, with more transparent methods also, with more methods that are and measures that are better, far more better than the journal impact factor. But they are not used because they are just too difficult to explain. Nobody understands them, and so on. So that is really a discussion we have, and we have to have that with the administration of academia. And so there are a lot of initiatives that are trying to overcome this problem. For example, COARA, this is the Coalition on Research Assessment, which is a little bit pushed by the European Commission to just change the way we evaluate, especially researchers themselves. So I think the main idea here is to combine numbers, pure numbers, with narratives, with explanations, with more transparent information about how those numbers came into being, and also always asking the person who is evaluated about how they explain what is going on, or whether they decided to not publish in Nature, for example, or how their profile developed in the end. So this is, I think, the major idea right now, to have a better and more detailed conversation about the person who should be evaluated and the bibliometric information you can get about that person. And that is also a good approach. But of course, this takes time. this costs a lot because you have to read the papers, for example, to decide whether the person has done good work. You have to talk to them. You have to do the analysis anyway. You have to compile all the data, as we talked about before. This is an open question, to be honest. And the only thing we can do right now is to be more transparent about, how we came up with our results, what data we used, what biases we have seen in the data was not shown, for example, and just lay out everything we know and then talk about that. Yeah, and I think as a scientific community, we really have to take the time to do that, even if it's painful. But there's no easy solution for that, because when we come up with the easy solution, it will be a number, I think. and we will not be happy with an easy solution anyway, because it's not easy to decide what is good research. It's not easy to decide what is a good researcher. And even as an evaluator, you should be more clear about and more upfront about the criteria you want to use for selecting somebody, right? So, and even this is hard to formulate. And as long as we are in this kind of relationship, no number will be the perfect answer. It has to be a conversation between the researchers and the evaluators. I think that would be my approach.
Yes, I share that approach. I share that appreciation for conversation. I can't help but think of the risk of, we like to think of academia as such a meritocratic space. But I think one of the impulses towards using metrics and measuring things as a proxy for merit is that we are concerned about corruption, nepotism, people appointing or giving funds to their friends. And these sorts of metrics enable us to try to take a step towards making sure that people who attain academic positions have done so on a meritocratic basis. Ironically, the presumption of this conversation is that the perverse outcomes do not lead to the most meritocratic individuals rising to the top, because the proxies we're using for quality are corrupted. So is there a balance to be struck between that? Am I onto something here?
Those indicators that are based on citations, for instance, are probably far from being a really good tool to achieve a meritocratic way of assessing research, but they are not useless. So one shouldn't conclude from all this criticism and all these flaws that these indicators have that we spoke about, that we would be better off with not doing any kind of quantitative analysis, I think. I think Isabella explained it really, really well, that what's often missing is explanation and conversation about the limitations of indicators that are used, about the biases that are known to be within them, and about all those facets of academic work that they do not reflect at all, that aren't really covered by any publication-based metric. For instance, everything that has to do with teaching, basically. And that I think wouldn't mean that the only valid conclusion is to just abandon all indicators, all numeric indicators completely, and to say, okay, those don't serve us well because they have so many flaws. Still doing everything with qualitative peer review is utopian. That's something that will never happen, and that wouldn't be sustainable at all, and wouldn't be scalable at all. Yeah, I think we somehow have to make the best out of the tools that are out there, and be maybe more careful in how we use them, and more reflective about their limitations than one often was in the past, but not to say, okay, they are useless.
Yeah, it's a tough question. I mean, there are many people out there who are discussing that question, and there are many experts involved. And if you have the answer to that, then publish it in Nature, maybe, so that we all know. Of course, numbers are a way to make evaluations more objective, but in the end, I think there are good reasons to argue why it should not be objective, right? So because you have reasons for your publishing behavior, for example. Yeah, and then the other hand, well, it should be more objective because it should only be what you really do in research and should be the quality of your research. But there are also ideas of even taking into account, as Stefan said, like what you do in teaching, but also, the idea of having like virtues of the person and assess that. But how? I mean, how would you want to do that? Should we all build up profiles and so that our colleagues are rating us in terms of friendliness? And I'm not sure whether I would like to see that in a public database, for example. So ideas are floating around, I'd say, but we really have to see what is scalable and practicable, and it's not an easy conversation. We have seen now that a good idea turned into something we are all not very happy with, and now we have to adjust. And I think that is that is the whole task of science and research, to see what's going on and to find new measures. And we are all bright and clever people, so I think there will be a solution. Maybe it will take some time, but there should be a solution. I'm convinced.
Well, I'm wondering about clever people and clever machines. If we set aside the issue of social credit to evaluate the merit of us as people, as teachers, as members of the scholarly community, but rather just focus on how we measure our contributions to the research beyond citations. Is there room for artificial intelligence to pick up some of those questions that Stefan was suggesting around the problems of scalability and sustainability with using peer review for everything that is qualitative as opposed to quantitative? Is there scope for AI to perhaps contribute to qualitative assessments beyond citations of innovativeness or other characteristics or dimensions of research value?
So very foundational problems that I would always see there are transparency and reproducibility. That those, at least to my understanding of large language models, and I assume that those are what we are basically thinking about here, that those will remain a difficulty in using them in any kind of assessment tasks that is meant to inform important decisions about researcher careers. Yeah, so I'm not an expert on AI or LLMs, but instantly comes to my mind and makes me skeptical of really using LLMs to tackle this problem of scalability and to use LLMs to basically make peer review scalable. But I don't know. I'd assume that many people are already working on exactly that and are training specific models that are meant to do peer review better than ChatGPT would do it. But I remain skeptical.
This is a good academic posture, to be skeptical, as we should.
And as long as we want to evaluate people and make decisions about people, I think people should make those decisions. They can use, it could be an informed decision, of course, so you could use tools to do that, but I would not leave that to AI. And I think this is just an ethical position, right? So it's something we do not want, but that is something we as an academic community would need to formulate first, right? So, I mean, the same was happening before. We used a mechanism, citations, in their various forms of aggregation to evaluate people. And that is something we found that we should not do that anymore. And now just throwing a large language model on people is the same, I think. And that's something we should not do, but we could use that to get some information, which we hadn't have before. So that, I think that could be the use case. But on the other hand, who knows what the future will look like if we are, all writing our papers with the help of artificial intelligence. Then we can optimize it for innovation, for example, and so on. So this is a self-fulfilling prophecy even, because this is just a race of arms and who is faster and And probably we will find another way of being more clever than the large language model.
I am so grateful for this conversation. It's been really stimulating. I had no idea that citations could be so much fun. Thank you both so much for joining us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
That was Drs. Stefan Lemke and Isabella Peters. And this has been another episode of Sustainability Matters. Don't forget, you can also participate in the podcast. Let us know what you think of Sustainability Matters. If you would like us to cover any particular topics in future episodes, or if you have thoughts on research promotion that you would like us to explore, write to us and let us know. Our email is podcast@brill.com. We would love to hear from you. And if enough of you write to us about research promotion or any other topic related to sustainability in scholarly publishing and beyond, we do promise to explore it in another episode. Thank you again, as always, for being with us. I am your host, Ramsey Nasser, and I will see you again next month.
You are listening to Sustainability Matters by Gruyter Brill.